Good evening. I'm Lynn Johnson, and this is our second section of our MX series for this fall. We're doing 10 weeks, and each week we are looking at a different issue that faces Fort Collins. And last week we talked about immigration issues with Isaac, and this week we have Christina Taylor. She is the Executive Director of the Early Childhood Council of Larimer County. And she's going to talk to us about the very important issue of affordable child care in this community, because that is something that many parents face, and particularly those parents who have lower incomes face this issue. If you are online, Karen is over there with the computer. And if you would like to make a comment, you need to use the chat box. If you type it to her, then she will relay it up front here to Christina. So thank you very much.
Hello. As Lynn mentioned, my name is Christina Taylor. I'm the CEO of the Early Childhood Council of Larimer County. Lynn invited me tonight to just talk to you all about the state of the early child care sector in Larimer County and really the whole country. As Lynn mentioned, child care remains unaffordable for many families. Next slide, please. The average cost of care in a year for one child is up to $12,000 for a preschool-aged child. It's often up to $16,000 to $20,000 a year for an infant, which is more than college tuition for in-state students here at CSU in a year. In addition to that, there's a 40% shortage in child care access for families with preschoolers, and a 75% shortage for families, with infants and toddlers. And it takes about 37% of a family's income, based on the average median household income, to cover child care for a family of 4 with 2 kids under 5. 37% of their annual income. Next slide, please. So I'm sure many of you know this, but I'll cover just briefly why early childhood is important. Early childhood really sets the basis for children and their lifelong health and well-being. It increases graduation rates for high school. It increases lifelong earnings. Earlier on, it increases kindergarten readiness and 3rd grade reading scores. We know that children that have access to quality early education have much higher achievement in their later life, and it's incredibly important for the development of those young minds. Next slide. There's an equation online called the Heckman equation. An economist did some research on what the return on investment is for early care and education in our country, and really encourage you to look that up and read more about kind of every dollar invested really returns quite a bit to our economy. But it also leads to decreased healthcare costs down the road for those children that have access, decreased crime rates for an entire community, increased lifetime earnings, and decreased employment costs. All of those things cost our society an intense amount of money, and this is our opportunity to save that early on. Next slide. The other huge impact that child care access has is on our economy. Especially over the last year, I think it's become more apparent to most individuals just how important access to early child care is, especially for employers. We've learned that 10% of Colorado residents in any given year quit or don't take jobs because of child care access issues. During the pandemic, of course, this challenge was heightened significantly, and Larimer County families reduced their work by 42% due to lack of child care over the last year and a half. If you can just imagine for a moment the ripple effect that has on our economy, it's intense. It also has a huge impact on our ability to attract and retain qualified employers. Next slide. So lack of child care access can lead to increased work absences and remove talented employees from the workforce. In the last year alone, more than 20 million women in the United States have left the workforce because of the pandemic and child care access issues. And we know that women have a huge benefit on our economic output as a country and as our economic health. And so getting those individuals back to work is paramount. Next slide. Locally, in 2008, and that data feels old, but I can tell you that this data point is worse probably now than it was many years ago. But the United Way and the Coloradan conducted a community-wide study on poverty in Larimer County to determine sort of the root causes of that. And they determined that affordable childcare was the single greatest deterrent to a family's self-sufficiency locally. Families spending 37% of their income on childcare means that they're not investing in local housing, they're not sending their children to higher education, they're not making larger purchases within our economy. They're not even able to pay for basic costs like healthcare when they're spending that much of their annual salary on childcare access. Next slide. So I get asked a lot, why is there such a shortage of childcare? One of the things that myself and many of my colleagues will tell you is that childcare is considered a classic market failure. I got lucky because incidentally the Treasury Department of the United States released a study just a couple days ago that really broke this down in a concise way. And this quote by Treasury Secretary Yellen on the second line here is that it's past time that we treat childcare as what it is, an element whose contribution to economic growth is as essential as infrastructure or energy. We do not invest in early childcare as a public good enough in our country. There are some states that offer universal pre-K. Colorado was kind of behind the curve in offering full-day kindergarten only in the last couple of years for free. There's Head Start, early Head Start, things like that, but it's not nearly enough to meet the need of early care and education access. The Federal Health and Human Services, they did a study probably 10 years ago to give us a picture of how much was economically viable for a family to spend on early care and education access out of their annual income, and landed on 7% being the absolute max that we could expect a family to pay while still being able to manage their other basic needs and contribute to our economy. On average, most families pay between 13 and 30% of their annual income on childcare, depending on how many children they have, the ages of those children, and the access that they have in our community. So we're far, far above that reasonable standard for families to be able to afford childcare. Next slide. Another big reason for the shortage is our workforce. Early care and education specialists or educators have to go through a rigorous credentialing process to become a licensed teacher. Many of them have bachelor's or master's degrees and have to go through a lot of regulatory requirements and qualification requirements set by our state. And yet those individuals are making between $13 and $15 an hour on average. Lynn mentioned that it's important to highlight that that is not enough to live in our community. The self-sufficiency standard back 3 years ago in Larimer County for a family of 4 was $60,000, meaning you had to make at least $60,000 to be able to afford housing, to be able to afford all your other basic necessities. And as you can see, $13 to $15 an hour is not anywhere close to reaching that standard. It's also a really demanding field, especially in the last year and a half, but always. Caring and educating little minds is tiring, it's exhausting. You're dealing with the mental health and social emotional well-being of several children at a time. You're helping children develop their coping mechanisms and their ability to communicate, and you're often doing that in a way that can be challenging for an adult because these children learn in very different ways. Because this is such an emotionally and physically taxing position, and we're paying it so poorly, is why we continue to have a tremendous turnover in early care and education programs. There's a program here locally that I've talked to recently that in the last year hired 48 new staff members, and in the course of a year turned over 45 of them. So they're just incapable of keeping those staff in the classrooms, which means they're closing classrooms, families aren't able to bring their kids to care, and programs are operating at reduced capacity. And we can't hire them fast enough, so there has to be more done there. Next slide. So this all sounds pretty dire, right? Like, what is there for families? How do we support families and getting to work if they choose to, and taking care of their children, and in having that really important first 5 years as a basis for their learning and life? There are several options currently available. The first that comes to mind would be the Colorado Child Care Assistance Program, or CCAP. That's a fund administered by the Larimer County Department of Human Services, and they currently distribute between $5 and $6 million a year to cover tuition costs for families. But it only covers our lowest income families, so those at a certain percent of the poverty level and below. And it's leaving behind a lot of families that are on the cusp or are right in that sweet spot of the middle class where they're making too much to qualify for social services, but still really can't afford to put 40% of their annual income into childcare. The United Way of Larimer County has done a tremendous job over the last several years of raising private donor dollars to create a scholarship fund for families in our community. They partner with us at the Early Childhood Council to distribute that funding, and currently we have about $500,000 that goes towards families. Obviously not enough. There are a few programs in Larimer County that have sliding scales and scholarships, so normally are nonprofit programs that are able to go out and raise donor dollars to cover tuition for families. I mentioned before there's the Colorado Preschool Program, which really is a limited population of our lower income families. Head Start, and then in November of 2019, we approved Proposition EE as a state, which will expand universal pre-K for all 4-year-olds. Unfortunately, that will only cover 10 hours of care in a week. And as you all know, that's a quarter of a work week for the average working adult. And so it will, while it's great, it's a step in the right direction, it's definitely not going to be enough for families to be able to send their kids to preschool and be able to work still. So a lot more work has to be done. Next slide. Another option that's important for people to know about is the Larimer Child Care Connect. Probably in August of last year, we at the Early Childhood Council were getting calls from our partners at the Workforce Center saying that they had individuals that were ready to work, ready to get out there, find jobs during the pandemic, but could not find childcare. Couldn't find an opening no matter where they called. On the flip side, we had providers calling us and saying, we've never had openings before. We've always operated on a wait list, so I have no idea how to advertise these spots. There's no one coming to our program. Obviously, all of this was a symptom of the pandemic. But we as the Early Childhood Council partnered with the Larimer County Department of Human Services for grant funding to launch a local referral portal. And so this is a free service to Larimer County families to access real-time supply of childcare in our community. So programs update weekly to let us know if they have openings, and families can get in here, search by their commute, search by where they're working or where they live. And we hope as many families in our community as possible are taking advantage of this free service. Next slide. In terms of solutions, there is a lot of discussion around the country around childcare access right now. Pick up any newspaper, magazine, anything. You're going to see an article about what are we going to do about childcare? How are we going to make sure that these kids get what they need? There's been federal solutions proposed, and we at the Early Childhood Council and with our partners at United Way have worked very hard on local solutions as well. And so I'll talk a little bit about what those look like. Next slide. The federal solutions that are currently being debated are largely contained in President Biden's Build Back Better proposal. This proposal would provide universal preschool access to all 3- and 4-year-old children, and expanding access to high-quality childcare for low and middle-income adults. It's unclear exactly how much that would cover. Again, we passed Proposition EE locally, and it turns out we're only able to afford 10 hours a week. The other proposal within the Build Back Better is capping family spending on childcare at 7%. This would be incredible if it was able to pass at the federal level. I can tell you that when it comes to the debating on both sides of the aisle and the cutting and slimming and shaving of bills when they're proposed, childcare is very often the one that gets sliced and diced. And so we don't have a ton of faith, unfortunately, that the issue will really be fixed, at least at the federal level, and that we're hopeful that there will be additional supports. You have a question?
Well, do you have to wear a mask?
Do I have to wear a mask?
Does she have to wear a mask?
I'll take it off. I'm all the way up here. Apologies for that. In terms of local solutions, next slide, please. We at the Early Childhood Council have engaged in an extensive policy research process over the last several months, starting back in January of last year, building upon the work of my predecessor and many of our partners in the community over the last decade or so. We've done extensive research on examples of successful local funding models here in Colorado and elsewhere that really support early care and education access in a way that is sustainable and would truly have an impact. So I've highlighted a couple here. San Miguel County in Telluride has a local property tax that funds early care and education access for their community. Summit County has something similar in place. Breckenridge as well, and then Multnomah County, Oregon just passed a universal pre-K tax in their county, and we'll be rolling that out here soon. We've also looked at potential funding avenues. So thinking back to what Secretary Yellen said about treating childcare as an essential piece of economic growth, similar to infrastructure, we believe that early care and education is a public good. It's something that we need to be funding as something that families should have access to regardless of their work positions, their income status, their socioeconomic status, whatever. And so we've looked at funding avenues such as sales tax, property taxes, or taxes on marijuana, cigarettes, things like that. We did an extensive public polling last year, or earlier this year, so that meant we hired a research firm that did voter polling similar to if the president was running and they were calling around asking folks what they were going to vote for and why. We also convened, you can go to the next slide, please. We also convened a 17-member steering committee. Those are wordy slides, you don't have to read it. Of community leaders around Larimer County to help us really flesh out a clear picture on local policy solutions. And at the end of all of this, that group in June recommended to our Board of County Commissioners to refer a ballot proposal this year. Now, I received my blue book today, and I'm sure you noticed that it's not in there. If you go to the next slide, please. We'll talk a little bit about what we hoped to fund. So this proposal that our 17-member steering committee put forth was a question on the 21 ballot to voters to increase the countywide sales and use tax by 0.25%, or a quarter on a $100 purchase, which would generate an estimated $17 million a year. For context, we currently, as a community, invest about $13.5 million into child care access, and we are falling very short of the mark in what is needed. The measure would specify that the revenue generated by the tax would cover these four purposes. First and foremost being covering tuition costs for families. The second would be investing in the early childhood system, namely the workforce. As I mentioned, we are in a workforce crisis and we have to find ways to pay early care and education specialists better, but also recruit and retain them in the field through benefits, through better working environments, through additional support so that they stay in the classroom and provide high quality care. The other two buckets of funding that were identified by the steering committee were extensive evaluation to ensure that we were being responsive to the community and also having a true impact with taxpayer funding. And then capping administrative percent, meaning that the cost to run this programming, run this tax dollar, this huge amount of tax dollars would be capped so that the most money would get out to the community. Next slide. Sorry, I can't see my slide here. The steering committee was very specific in terms of ensuring that the funding would support ages 0 to 5, so not just that pre-K age, because we know that infants and toddlers are incredibly expensive and difficult to find care for. That families of all incomes should be eligible to receive tuition subsidies, so it would be a sliding scale model that would help everyone. And that capacity and quality investments should be made to ensure that there are spaces and human capital in order to offer quality care. Next slide. Last two pieces of this measure were a 20-year sunset, which really holds the administering body to be accountable to taxpayers and the funding that they're administering. And then the last recommendation was that the county partner with the Early Childhood Council, our organization, to administer and manage the funding. And that's largely because we are a statutorily defined organization. We're in state statute and legislation to support the early childhood system locally. And this is the work that we've been doing for 20 plus years. Next slide, please. So we put forward a proposal in July and asked our county commissioners to refer rather than seeking signatures, because we're in a pandemic and signature seeking is both extraordinarily expensive because no one wants to go out and gather signatures, and incredibly unsafe. We didn't feel it was appropriate to ask individuals to go out, collect signatures, and put their lives at risk. Through about a month and a half of discussion with the Board of County Commissioners, we chose to step away from a ballot initiative this year, largely because it was determined we didn't have enough time to come to a clear agreement on that public-private partnership and a cap on administrative expenses to ensure that the most amount of money went out to the community. That doesn't mean we're done. This is an issue that is continuing to grow, not going away. And so I shared this proposal with you, one, because you've likely heard about it. It was in many of our papers over the last 7 to 8 months, but also because this proposal was thoughtfully designed and something that we intend to carry forward and find a way to implement in our community, because we know it's incredibly important. Next slide. Lastly, I wanted to just cover ways that the community can help. We often get calls from folks saying, what can we do to impact this issue? And it is incredibly complex when it comes to keeping educators in the field, when it comes to finding and paying for tuition subsidies for families. But there are ways for our community members, our faith community, to really contribute to childcare access in Larimer County. One is to get involved in policy work. So over the last 7 or 8 months, we had lots of community members calling their commissioners, showing up at administrative matters meetings, having conversations with their elected officials to say, this is something we need. This is something that's essential and we need to move it forward. So that's an excellent way for individuals that are interested to get more involved, really to reach out to us at the Early Childhood Council. United Way is another huge partner for us. Another way to support is to donate to local child care funds. So as I mentioned, United Way has a child care fund at about $500,000 right now, which we anticipate will support maybe 200 to 300 families. There's also nonprofit centers here in Fort Collins that do sliding scales and scholarships for families that can't afford care, and they take donations and hold fundraisers. Those are great ways to support. Two of the bigger ones that I think people don't think about a lot, especially if you work in a business or have any sort of say in how that business is run, is family-friendly business practices. So for instance, in our organization, we've made pretty sweeping changes over the last 2.5 years to ensure that we are creating a work environment that allows our employees to also be parents and to do both successfully. And so that includes flexible working environments. We allow babies in the office up to 6 months of age. It allows for flexible work spaces, so whether it be in the office, whether it be at home, whether it be a hybrid of both. We allow for flexible work hours, so if you've got a brand new baby at home and you need to work at 10 p.m., that's okay. That's a really great way to make an impact on the individuals that you work with every day, is to create more of those family-friendly environments. Businesses are also able to establish benefit plans that support childcare access, so providing stipends to your employees to be able to cover childcare, to providing, I believe the city of Fort Collins offers backup care. So if you already have a childcare provider but they get sick or the center closes, you can call a number with the city of Fort Collins and they'll give you a backup provider for that day. Things like that. There's lots of different ways that businesses can support their employees in being parents and being successful employees. And then the last one is employer-based supports. There are lots of businesses in our community that are considering offering childcare on site, and that can be another great way to support childcare access, especially if you're opening additional spaces for families. One thing we at the council have been cautioning is that because we're in a workforce crisis, we don't want to put the cart before the horse, right? So if we go and build a new center and create a new classroom, you're still going to have a really hard time hiring staff because we've got 300 plus existing programs in Larimer County that can't hire staff. And so those investments in workforce supports are incredibly important as well. Can't remember what's on my last slide. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Other ways to become involved are, oh, I got lost, give me a minute. We have a public information campaign titled Larimer Thrive by 5. You can go to larimerthriveby5.org. We've got billboards around town. It's an excellent way to raise awareness about the issue. We talk about everything I've covered here, really the importance of early care and education access, all the way to the importance of the workforce, the impact on the economy, really ensuring that everyone in our community understands why this is such a key issue, and gives them a space to advocate and support. And then the Early Childhood Council holds monthly advisory council meetings. Those are the first Tuesday of every month from 9 to 11 a.m. and they're via Zoom currently, just like everything else. And that's another place where we share out kind of what's going on in the sector, how you can get involved, what we're doing as a council to have an impact in the work that we're doing. I think that's all I've got. If you want to go to the last slide. I'm here to answer questions if you have them. I'm grateful that you invited me to be here.
Hello.
Hi.
Oh my God. Shouldn't say that in the sanctuary. Why is it so loud? Anyway, it's kind of a two-part question.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing I noticed is that when you were talking about, I can't even remember what the title was, but you mentioned that there was Head Start, but it was just, there's Head Start. So Head Start isn't growing, seems to be dying.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of my question. My other part of my question is, the solutions that you have presented for Larimer County are mostly supporting ways to support the existing system,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to publicizing,
Mm-hmm.
is that a word? Making childcare more public,
Mm-hmm.
Publicly available, I guess is what I'm saying. Because, I mean, I think a big part of the problem is childcare is not affordable, and yet the people that work in childcare can't afford to work in childcare. Obviously, there's a big disconnect
Correct.
between the people who own the businesses and the people that work in the businesses.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see any sort of a solution for that, other than helping people pay, for their childcare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'll address the second part first because I didn't fully hear the first one. And so in terms of, you're right, a lot of the suggestions that I provided are Band-Aids. They're temporary fixes to what we see as a broken system. A reason I spent a good deal of time talking about making it a public good locally with taxpayer funding is because that is our proposal as a council and as a community to really flip the system on its head, to make it a public good. Some of that funding would go to supporting higher salaries for educators, but it would also continue supporting families to be able to afford care, all through a sustainable funding system that has very little impact on the average taxpayer in Larimer County, but then would create a way for us to essentially fix the system locally by making it a public good, by investing in it with local taxpayer funding. When it comes to what individuals in the community, our faith community, our business partners can do, it's unfortunate because it is either we invest and we vote on a ballot at some point to flip it on its head and to change the system, or we continue to put Band-Aids on, which was many of the suggestions that I've made. And unfortunately, it's because until we can truly flip the system on its head, we have to continue with the Band-Aids. It's just one of those awful issues that are very difficult to fix. And I think the second question was around Head Start.
Yeah.
What about Head Start?
Well, you just mentioned it.
Yeah, so Head
And
Start is one.
It used to be, I think the plan for Head Start was to at least fulfill some of this gap, some of the
Right.
difficulties, and then it seems to just be dying and dying. I worked in childcare for a while. I have a master's in early childhood education, so, and it changed a lot too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Head Start is one of those government-funded systems that exists to support children, largely low-income families, largely within the school systems. So here in Fort Collins, for instance, Head Start exists within the school system. I've been hearing, I had an individual that was in Greeley this morning talking to a Head Start office, and they're having a hard time filling their spots. And I'm not sure what that symptom, or what that's a symptom of. What I can say is we know that it's not enough. It's only covering those lowest income families, and it's really missing that gap of individuals that have decent jobs but still can't afford to pay 40% of their salary for childcare. In terms of employees making so much less than they should, part of the reason this is designated as a market failure is because if employers and childcare owners and directors were to raise wages of their teams, that would then be passed on to families. So it's the cyclical thing where, if we want to pay our staff more, then families have to pay more for care, and we've reached this unsustainable point where it's not going to keep working. Mm-hmm.
Looking down a couple years in the future, are you going to then pursue the ballot measures after, we get through the COVID thing?
Yeah, I think what that will look like exactly is really up to our community partners. We as an organization are very careful in ensuring that our voices are not the driving force, but that the community is. So we intend to reconvene with our community partners that help lead this process in January, give us all a little bit of time to breathe and get through the rest of this year, and really determine what our next steps are. But I can tell you that we've identified public funding as the sole solution locally for probably the last 10 years. So it's not going away. It's something my predecessor had spoken about. It's something that previous directors of United Way had ideas about. We just haven't done it yet. And so unfortunately we weren't able to do it this year, but it's definitely something we'll continue to pursue unless by some miracle the feds fix it, which I'm not going to hold my breath.
In addition, I know you're the early childhood council, but at the same time, for parents of school-age kids, you have all those before care hours and those after care hours. So is that as bad a situation for those younger kids in Larimer County, or
It is, yeah. I'm a parent of 2 school-age kids, so I have a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old, and I'm a single mother. And I can tell you that the only way I've survived as a public servant working for a nonprofit is programs like the Boys and Girls Club that offer free care for kids before and after school. Unfortunately, they rely a lot on their partnerships, and so this year I'm sure you've all heard about the nationwide bus driver shortages, for instance. Boys and Girls Club, they don't have bus drivers to bring the kids to their programs, and so kids are just going home to empty houses or wherever they can find. So that's one big issue, especially during the pandemic, but all the time, really. Boys and Girls Club is constantly raising money to cover the costs of the work that they're doing. There are programs in town that offer before and after school care, but they are prohibitively expensive. And so it is continuing to be an issue there as well. CCAP and some of the other early childhood funding can go up to a certain age point. And the work that we do goes up to age 8, but beyond that, it continues, you're right, yes, it continues to be a big access issue. When we talked about implementing local sales tax funding, for instance, while we know that $17 million won't even go quite far enough for that 0 to 5 range, what we did learn through this research process is if we're putting more public funding into the 0 to 5, then there can be more philanthropic investment in those older ages, like Boys and Girls Club, YMCA, et cetera, that are covering the after-school hours for families that have to work, until 7 or 8 at night or split shifts or whatever. And so that's kind of part of our multi-pronged solution, is if we can put more public investment in 0 to 5, we can really leverage our private philanthropic partners to invest more in school age.
Hi again. Is this on? There we go. Oh, shoot. Might have totally forgotten my question. Oh, I know. Do you have any numbers on the percentage of family daycare homes as opposed to larger facilities, I guess I would say?
Yeah, so in terms of, I think you're asking differences in types of care in our community. We have family child care providers. They cover about a third of our licensed child care providers in the community. There's just over 100. And then the remaining 200 are preschool programs and small to large centers that cover early care and education.
Who manages them?
It depends. So there's several programs in town that are run by national corporations that have childcare all over the country. There's many that are privately owned, so they own 1 or 2 centers here locally. There are some that exist within school district structures. I don't think we have any employer-based care programs here currently. So it really just depends.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any comments from home, Karen? Okay. I guess one of the things, I'm not sure everybody realizes just how much you touched on how much preparation a preschool teacher has to get, and also all those licensing requirements which add to the cost of the daycare center, because I know, I presume we're licensed through the state and stuff like that. If you could talk about that a little bit too, because that's another hidden cost nobody is really aware of.
Yeah, the cost to become a licensed child care provider is hefty. That's a big reason that we exist. So we provide scholarship funding, grant funding to individuals that want to become licensed providers. We cover their higher education. We have funding available for family child care providers that would like to become licensed, to do their background checks and their fingerprinting, to buy materials for their home providing space. We also advocate an extensive amount at the state to simplify the process as much as possible while still protecting quality and safety. As I'm sure you all know, oftentimes things in the government tend to become a big ball of red tape. And I think that early childhood has become one of those things where the qualifications to become an early childhood teacher far exceed what we're paying them to do, or what we're paying them for, you know. They're early educators. They're shaping the brain of these young lives. There's a statistic that we share all the time that there's more than 1 million neural connections formed in a child's brain every second in their first 5 years. And so every little experience that they have in those first 5 years really does create the basis for their entire life. And we're paying these individuals as if they're babysitters and requiring them to have the credentials of a college professor sometimes. So there's a big disconnect there, and we're really trying to bring those together, raise the wages of providers, keep the qualifications to become an early educator reasonable, so hopefully we meet somewhere in the middle so there's not this huge gap.
Are there other communities that have come up with a good program that you could take advantage of?
Yeah, so some of the case studies that I talked about in Summit County, San Miguel County, Multnomah, Oregon, they've really come up with really solid models that rely on local nonprofits to administer and roll out funding so that they keep as much red tape off of them as they can. But that really leverage public funding to create a system that is sustainable and supports families. And so that's really what we're aiming for here, is not necessarily to recreate the wheel. It is innovative for our community, but it's really been proven successful in other states and other communities in Colorado as a way to really fix the early care and education access issue. And so that's really what we're relying on, are those lessons.
It seems like that's a good opportunity for, I mean, everybody has this problem. This isn't unique to Larimer County.
Mm-hmm. Agreed, yeah, and I think that's why it's such a big topic of discussion at the federal level as well, as they realize that we've kicked this can as far down the road as we can. Now we really need to address it in a sustainable, systemic way.
Are there any daycares, or I'm thinking about the healthcare providers that work third shift. How do they get childcare?
They often rely on family and friends. The regulatory requirements for those all-day care or drop-in care or nighttime care are even bigger than a regular child care provider, and so it's really hard to get them in place. And so most often our healthcare community relies on their family, friends, neighbor network. We call it an FFN network. It's an incredibly crucial part of the early childhood system, and we don't know who they are or how they're providing care, where they're providing care, because they kind of do it on the fringes as needed.
Is there any opportunity here for daycare for a sick child to help the parents when they can't take them to the regular daycare?
That is a really good point, and that's happened a lot, as I'm sure you can imagine. In the last year and a half, we have people calling the council regularly saying, we've got a sick kiddo, what are we supposed to do? You can't take a child to child care sick, especially now, but always. And so no, there aren't a lot of options. A lot of folks, again, are relying on the friend, family, neighbor network or bringing in a part-time babysitter to just cover the time. It's really difficult to balance having young children and a full-time job. Almost impossible for some people.
And what about children who have special needs?
Again, we have a dearth of care. I'm sure many of you have heard about respite care here locally. They do a phenomenal job of providing a safe space for children with special health care needs or special needs in general. But we have very few slots for them in our community. And again, for a licensed program to accept children with special needs, the cost and the willingness of them to do it versus keeping staff it's untenable. So that's another, you're right, another subpopulation that tends to get overlooked. Respite Care is doing an incredible job here locally of taking care of those kiddos, but I'm sure there's many that are slipping through the cracks.
I think that some people don't realize that many minimum wage workers don't have sick time.
Right.
They don't have benefits. So if their child is sick and they have to stay home because they have no daycare, then they lose that day's wages.
Right.
And so that too is this circular thing that.
Well, and in addition to child care providers, making an average of $13 to $15 an hour, they don't have health care benefits.
Right.
They very often don't have paid leave benefits. They don't have retirement. It's not a job that they're equipped to stay in for a lifetime, even though we really need them to be that continuous provider of education and care for children.
And I think, I'm not sure everybody realizes minimum wage in Colorado right now is $12.32 an hour.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're only paying our child care workers $13, we're only exceeding that by about 60 cents, 70 cents.
And just to highlight, that's the average. So in the nature of averages, there's plenty that make less, all the way down to minimum wage.
So do we have any other questions this evening? We really appreciate you coming and sharing with us. This is a really important issue that I know our church has thought about in the past, and we may have further questions for you as we go down the road.
Please do. We included our contact information up there. I encourage anyone that is interested in getting involved, has questions, to reach out to us. That's why we're here. This is the work that we do every day, and are happy to support your involvement in any way that we can. Thank you for having me tonight.
Thank you. And we'll just say goodbye to our at-home viewers, and we'll be back next week at 6 o'clock with another issue. Thank you so much.